The first thing you'll want to dig into when making your architectural piece is to make something called an armature for your sculpture. An armature is the base form of a sculpture. It's usually made out of cheaper materials. In this case, we're using cardboard and paper to give the sculpture its shape. That way, we don't have to use all air dry clay or all plaster to build the big shape of our sculpture. An armature is like the skeleton of the sculpture that supports it and gives it its shape without using up too many or too much materials. So, to make our armature, we are all going to start with a box. You are going to unflatten your box and pop it into 3D space. And once you've got it into box form, you're going to want to tape the sides closed. Now we're going to work on adding the roof. For this, we're going to switch to another pretty cheap material, which is manila folders. It's a nice thick paper that will support the weight of the plaster and give it the shape of the roof. So, to get your piece of paper just the right size, you will want to put your box onto the folder and measure its width with a pencil, as you see me doing here. Once you've got the width of your roof marked out, you will take a pair of scissors and you will cut the paper to the right size. Now I'm making what's called a gabled roof. It is the classic triangular peaked roof that you'll see in most kids' drawings of houses. But here already you can start to use your creativity and you can veer off from what I'm doing. You can take a look at your resource sheet of architectural terms and you could choose a different style of roof to create on your sculpture. However, you may need to cut the manila folder paper a different shape, a different size. You may need to add more cardboard for height, depending on which type of roof you choose. But if you'd like to make a gabled roof, here's how it's done. Once you're done with sizing, cutting, and placing your roof, just tape it in place using masking tape. At this point, it's time to decide the basic shape of your building. You could go for a basic shape like I'm doing, just leaving it as a box. You could add more cardboard to make it asymmetrical. You could add even more cardboard to make it symmetrical, or you could create a row. But the thing is that your armature cannot get too big, because in that case it's going to take up a lot of plaster and a lot of air dry clay, and so you may be limited by me and asked to dial it back just a little bit. I've decided to keep the basic shape of the first box, but what I'm going to do to make the shape of my building more interesting is to add a pepper box turret. Another name for this would be a pepper pot. It's those cylindrical towers with cone-shaped roofs that you'll often see on castles. So to do that, I am going to take paper towel tubes and toilet paper tubes, and I'm going to use those for the cylinder of the pepper pot. And then I'm going to use more manila folder to roll into a cone, cut it to the proper size, and then attach it to the toilet paper tube, creating a pepper pot shape. So a detailed explanation on how to make a cone out of this thick manila folder paper is coming right up. You want to start with a rectangle of the manila paper, and then you're going to want to hold down the center with one hand as you gently bend and form the paper on the right and left towards the center. This should create, when completed, a point at the top. And at this point, you're going to want to tape the cone in place. Now we simply need to cut the bottom of this cone to the right size that we need and also even out that bottom. And to do that, you will simply flatten the cone. Don't crease it, just flatten it. And then use your scissors to cut from one side to the other in a curve. It's important to curve as you cut in order to create a circular base. From there, you can do fine tuning and adjustments. My cone had a couple of corners at the bottom, which I didn't want, and so I rotated the cone and snipped those off. And bada bing, bada boom, you got a cone. The next step is to attach that cone, right, to the cylinder of the toilet paper tube. You might be like, how do I do that? So here's how I did it. I ripped off a couple of pieces of tape, and then from the inside is where I taped them in place. So I put the tape through the top of the toilet paper tube, and I left a bit of the tape hanging out. Then I put the cone in its place and used a pencil, the eraser end, to push down the tape onto the cone from the inside. And I repeated that twice. That way, there's no tape that is messing up the shape of this pepper box. One thing I want to mention at this time is throughout this armature building process, just remember, it is an armature. It's not the final result. This will all be covered in plaster, and that will adjust its shape just a little bit. So if you're seeing a bunch of tape everywhere and stuff like that, it's natural for an armature to look a bit ugly. It's going to look a lot prettier once we wrap the whole thing in plaster. And here I go, I'm making another matching cone, and I used the first cone that I made to match the size, right? I'm going to make a total of 4 pepper box turrets, and so I want them to all be similar size and shape. My next move is to attach the 4 turrets that I've created onto the center formation, and I had to decide again, am I going to make a balanced symmetrical look? Am I going to switch to asymmetry where, the turrets aren't placed exactly on the same spot on each side? And I did place and replace them multiple times to get that just right look. And I used tape every time to attach them where I wanted them to go. In the end, after much experimentation, I decided I wanted an asymmetrical look with these turrets, and I wanted one of the turrets to be up on the slanted gable roof. So in that case, I had to gently flatten and cut the bottom of the toilet paper tube to make it match as closely as I could the angle of the roof so that it would stand straight up even though it's sitting on an angle. So that's something you may have to do as well. Every attachment and addition that you decide to create on this architecture piece should be taped securely in place with masking tape. And once you have the armature finished, you're ready to start wrapping it in plaster and adding details with air dry clay. Remember, the armature is not the finished product. And now it's time to wrap your entire armature, except the bottom, in bandage plaster. Here's what you'll need. A tray at your table of bandage plaster, which is plaster dust that's been inlaid into cheesecloth, a bowl of water, and a tablecloth. And of course, your armature. And here's how it all works. You will pick up a rather large piece of bandage plaster, dunk it into your bowl of water. It'll immediately become very floppy and want to roll on itself, and you want to try to keep it as flat as possible while not handling it too much so that you don't lose any of the plaster dust. And once you've got all that going on, you are going to begin wrapping your entire project all the way around except for the bottom surface of the building. And an important piece you might want to start with is covering the gap between your roof and the box below. Once your piece of plaster is in place on your armature, you will take your fingers to gently smooth out the texture of the bandage plaster. If you just lay it on your armature and skip the smoothing part, the bumpy texture of the cheesecloth is going to stay there until you paint it. It'll make it more difficult to paint and cover up all the white. And also, the texture is not very appealing. So make sure you take a moment to smooth out the plaster gently each time. You may find that the size or shape of the plaster that has been pre-cut for you is not going to work for what you need it for, right? You might need to change its shape or its size, and in that case, you can use a pair of scissors to cut it to the proper size. But you may only use plaster scissors to cut the plaster because plaster is very hard on scissors, and I don't want to ruin any of our nice paper cutting scissors. There should be at least one pair of scissors that are plaster scissors in your tray for each student at your table. As you're working, it's really important that we respect the plaster and ensure that we don't waste any. So while you're dunking your plaster into the water, make sure that no water gets into the plaster tray. If plaster gets wet and then it dries, it can no longer revive and be used. So if your unused plaster in the plaster tray gets wet or gets even a few drips of water into it, some of the plaster pieces will get ruined and wasted. And that's not very respectful to the material. So make sure that as you're carrying your wet plaster from the bowl of water to your armature, that it is not dripping over the fresh plaster tray. Additionally, it's really important to not drip any plaster, water, or plaster itself directly onto the table. Please make sure that you're working over a tablecloth, or if we're at the point in the project where you are working on plaster and no one else is, you will have a plaster mat to work on. Do not drip the plaster directly onto the table. It is very difficult to clean up. Here you can see I've got most of my armature covered up with bandage plaster. It's time to kind of refine everything and do a bit of sculpting before it hardens into place. So I'm doing some additional smoothing, and you may notice when you're trying to smooth the plaster that there's not enough dust on the cheesecloth. So when you try to smooth it with your hands, nothing really happens. In that case, you can actually go into your plaster tray, pick up some plaster dust, and sprinkle it onto the part where the cheesecloth is exposed, like so. Then add a bit of water and smear to smooth. Once you're all done plastering your armature, it's obviously time to clean up. When you clean up, there are two very important things that you should know. First of all, do not ever dump the plaster water in the bowl down the drain in the sink. I will have a big plastic tub. It used to be for cat litter. It's called the slop bucket. You need to dump all your plaster water into that slop bucket, and I have my student aide or myself dump it out into the dumpster so that no pipes get clogged up and nobody has to foot the bill. Also, you are responsible for taking a dry paper towel and wiping off your work area from the tablecloths. Please do not forget to use a dry paper towel to wipe off your workspace before those tarps get rolled up and put away. That way, when we unroll them again for our next plaster work time, it's not super dusty and messy. After your plaster has been applied and dried, it's time to add the finer details of your architectural sculpture using air dry clay. Air dry clay works a lot like regular clay. For example, you can smooth it and soften it using water. To attach pieces together, you should scratch and score the two pieces using water and a texturing tool. I prefer to use toothbrushes. Some people prefer to use needle tools to score the two pieces of clay and stick them together. Additionally, air dry clay is a lot like normal clay. because you should be working on a canvas mat. It will stick to the art room tables, so make sure that you're working on a canvas mat to avoid destroying your hard work by having it suction cup to the table. You can use the air dry clay to add the finer details to your building, such as roof tiles, windows, doors, gargoyles, bushes, and anything else that you couldn't accomplish with the plaster. Just like when working with regular clay, your table will be provided with a toolbox that will have rolling pins and spray bottles and sculpting tools. As you create each piece of air dry clay to attach to your building structure, you will use Elmer's glue to attach the wet clay to the plaster. In some cases, you'll want to do all of the sculpting separately, prepare your piece of air dry clay, and then glue it on once it is sculpted. That's what I did with the little gargoyle. In other cases, like with this roof that I am trying to create, I attach the air dry clay with glue to the structure first, and then I continue sculpting it while it's on the main structure. So here you can see me using both methods, sculpting it separately and then gluing it on while still wet, or actually gluing on the air dry clay first and then sculpting it further once it's actually attached. Once you are done with your air dry clay attachments, you need to make sure that you cover your piece with a plastic grocery bag in order to slow down the drying process and avoid cracking. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, and the final step of this sculpture project is to paint the entire thing. You will be using something called tempera paint to paint these in. They're liquid paints, and they're in condiment bottles at your tables. You need to pour the paint into pallets, and you need to do all the mixing yourself. You'll only have the 3 primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, plus the neutrals, black, white, and brown, and you will have gold if you want to get metallic. Here's the thing about pouring the paint. First of all, in the boxes of paint, there will be a cup, and the cup will have stretched out paper clips inside. These stretched out paper clips are so that you can unclog the paint bottles as needed. If you go to pour some paint and you realize the paint's not coming out, please don't force it, because then we'll have a paint explosion on our hands, and that takes so long to clean up. It's horrible. So instead of forcing the paint out of there, what you should do is take one of those stretched out paper clips and poke it through the top to clear the way. And then when you're ready to pour your paint, please only pour up to halfway up the well. Also, try to strategize and think ahead. Any paint that you pour out of the bottle is either going to be used or it's going to be washed down the drain. Unfortunately, there's no good way to get paint back into the paint bottles, so be really conscientious as you're pouring your paint and only pour what you're actually going to use. Another tip when mixing paint is to always add the darker color to the lighter color. For example, to make my gray here for the walls of my castle, I added the black paint to the white paint, little by little, until I got the perfect gray that I wanted. I did not add the white paint to the black paint, because that takes a really long time to actually change black paint with white paint. It's much more efficient to do it the other way around. As you're painting your sculpture, you'll notice that there are a lot of textures and bumps on it, and white spots are really common. So to avoid white spots, what you should do is load up your paintbrush with a lot of paint. And also, Incorporate a bit of water into the paint to make it stretch further and fill in all the textures on your piece. Remember, this is a sculpture, so it's three-dimensional and it's meant to be looked at from all the way around. So you're going to want to really turn your piece and look at it from many different angles to make sure that you hit all the white spots and it's all covered in beautiful paint.